From the Institute for Research on Public Policy, this is Future-Proofing Canada. I'm your host, Jennifer Ditchburn, the President and CEO of the IRPP. There's a lot coming at us these days. Our country faces interconnected challenges, including a new geopolitical world order, economic headwinds, climate change, technological disruptions, shifting demographics, and deepening inequality. Future-Proofing Canada brings you conversations with the people who are looking for solutions to these challenges. They envision a Canada that's confident and ready to seize opportunities. Here's a Canadian pop quiz for you. Which of the provinces came together to form the new Dominion in 1867? If you guessed Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, I will send you a red ribbon. You got it right. Those were the OGs. And yes, two of those were from Atlantic Canada. At the time, Atlantic Canada had a flourishing trade with Britain, with the United States, and the British colonies. And there were many voices actually who argued against joining Confederation because how well things were going at the time for those provinces. Going much further back, First Nations in the region had well-established trade routes, including the Mi'kmaq and the Wolastoqiyik people. Trade is part of the DNA in Atlantic Canada, and it's an area of exciting new economic possibilities. In this week's episode, I talked to someone who has his eye on the region, David Chaundy, the President and CEO of the Atlantic Economic Council. Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Jennifer. Nice to be here.
It's always lovely to have a think tank peer on the show, and there's not that many of us in Canada. And I see you've been with the council for a long time, since 1999. You started as an economist, so you're very familiar with economics of the region.
Indeed, yes.
So maybe tell me what you see as the big changes and shifts in Atlantic Canada over the past 26 years that you've been watching the economy closely.
Sure. I think if we kind of look back, we've certainly seen progress over this time. We've seen our economies expand. We've seen incomes rise. But when we look at growth rates, typically over that kind of the last 2 or 3 decades, we've seen a continuation of those growth rates really slowing down over time until the last kind of 4 or 5 years, where we've seen population growth actually starting to accelerate. We've typically had slower growth than nationally. We've seen immigration. We've seen some relatively fast and even some historic population growth rates. So that's certainly been quite a change, but I think it's more temporary, and it's only in the last few years. We've also seen on our labor market continued improvement over the decades. Unemployment rates have really dropped quite considerably in both our urban areas as well as in our rural communities. But I think the biggest change that I've seen is what I kind of refer to as industrial restructuring. We've seen new industries emerge. When I moved here to Nova Scotia at the end of 1999, all the excitement was around Nova Scotia's offshore Sable project. It's offshore natural gas. That project has come and gone. While I've been here, we've also seen a big push on call centers and back offices. We've seen some of those come, and we've seen some of those close. And especially when you look at New Brunswick and Newfoundland and Labrador in particular, we've had a number of mines close. We've had a lot of our forest product mills close. We've got one last remaining newsprint mill left in Newfoundland, which now has transitioned a bit. And especially when we had the high Canadian dollar and our small scale, we really saw a lot of our traditional industries and some of those big plants close. On the other hand, we've seen, expansion of our offshore oil industry in Newfoundland and Labrador with a number of new projects or expansion of projects. PEI has seen growth in new sectors like bioscience and aerospace. IT across the region has grown. We've seen back office financial services in Halifax. So when you look across the economy, we've certainly seen, losses of, maybe 500 older male jobs in rural communities as some of these plants and mines have closed. But we've also seen some of these newer smaller firms in technology innovation sectors grow, often in our urban communities. So it's really been quite a shift in our industrial structure, in our geographic structure of what's really driving the economy. And I think that's probably the biggest change over that period. You don't see it year to year, but over several decades, you see really quite a transformation in terms of our economic base here in Atlantic Canada.
I certainly got a picture of that earlier this year. I was visiting Sydney in Cape Breton and Port aux Basques, Channel Port aux Basques in Newfoundland and Labrador, and seeing in real time a transition away from what you just described as some traditional industries. In Cape Breton, obviously, we're talking
Yes,
about coal and fishing and some exciting areas around wind power, wind technology, and also education. I would think is a kind of industry in and of itself. If
indeed.
you think of some of the universities and how they've flourished, universities and colleges, I guess.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
and so, thank you for taking us through a picture of what's happening in different provinces. How would you say that the tariffs are impacting the region specifically? We know that tariffs are touching all across Canada and in different areas, whether it's in steel, whether it's in lumber, aluminum. But in Atlantic Canada, can you take me through that? What are our different industries feeling?
Sure. And again, I think there's definitely some similarities with what Atlantic Canada's experience as we are nationally. And again, I think, some of the bigger impacts we may not be yet seeing in the data, just as the same as nationally. I know that firms are maybe not hiring certain things, they're cutting back on investment, they're looking at diversifying. We're maybe not seeing these fully in the trade metrics. Our employment is down so far in the first 6 months of this year. US exports are down, non-US exports have increased. And again, this is a big part of our economy. 12% of our GDP, 78,000 jobs tied to those US exports in this region. So it's really critical. But you look at New Brunswick, for example, 90% of its exports go to the US. This is really the most dependent province in terms of share of exports to the US. 98% of its refined petroleum. We have the biggest refinery in Canada. 91% of its lumber, not as big as BC, but it's a critical part of its economy. Newfoundland and Labrador is actually less dependent. Only about 50% of its exports go to the US because it has a much bigger proportion going to Europe, for example. But when you look at those exports relative to its economy, it is actually even more dependent than New Brunswick. But we have a lot of products. Michelin tires in Nova Scotia, almost 99% go to the US. Processed potatoes from PEI, 95%. So it's very hard in a very short term to, okay, let's find some new markets, let's develop those. So those pressures on some of those industries are really quite intense. And again, we have a lot of small exporters in some of these areas. And again, they will find it more challenging to have the resources to really look at developing kind of those new markets. So those effects are there. And we also have, Chinese tariffs on our seafood products. So there's not, it's not just the US where we've got issues, but, we've got 2,100 exporters in this region. So they're all kind of wrestling with this, and importers too, who are then kind of facing with some of the higher costs that they might be importing from the US.
Are there some ways that you and your colleagues have identified of that federal and provincial governments could be helping the different industries in Atlantic Canada? Some tools that they have at their disposal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly, we can talk about trade diversification, and we can talk about, the government's looking at how you assist some of those specific industries that are being affected. I think, it does point to a broader productivity and competitiveness issue. And it's also a number of other programs. So, we're facing in Atlantic Canada, as we are nationally, cutbacks to national immigration. But those immigration programs are particularly relevant in Atlantic Canada, where our population is shrinking. So that is adding to some of those labor force pressures as a time when we've got competitive challenges in the US. So certainly that is, one area where the government can help. But I think there's also, ways we can think about. There's opportunities here in Atlantic Canada as we think about increasing defense spending nationally. We've got two of the largest bases, military bases in Canada, in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. We've got, Goose Bay in Labrador, which might be able to help, if we're looking at the Arctic. We've got energy as we look to develop an energy superpower. We've got ports on the East Coast to support diversification for Canadian importers and exporters. So I think it's not just about support, it's about this region actually has some assets that can help Canada as it looks to diversify, as it looks to strengthen its military, as it looks to reduce its energy dependence on the US and look for other markets. So I think there's lots of opportunities here in this region where this region can actually contribute to what the national agenda actually is.
Are could you share, let's say, two or three major projects or opportunities that you think should really be at the top of the list? And as we understand, Prime Minister Carney is creating that short list. He's revealed a few actually this week on some priority areas for, let's say, nation building type projects. Are there some that you would point to in particular?
Well, certainly I'm not going to speak for the premiers and what they're particularly kind of advocating to the prime minister for their specific province. But in terms of what is being discussed and what we see, certainly energy is a big part of that. Newfoundland and Labrador and Quebec are negotiating to expand, the Churchill Falls hydroelectricity project and develop the Gull Island. That's clean hydropower that can help not only Labrador and the island, but also Quebec and other places. So again, that's certainly a key project that they're looking to get advanced. Premier Houston, Nova Scotia, has been advocating and trying to push offshore wind that maybe now has greater capacity, which can help not just Nova Scotia with its transition away from coal, but also then as long as there's transmission lines, that can then be power that's supplied to the rest of Canada. So, I certainly think energy, both offshore wind, transmission lines are a key part in this region. PI is dependent on the link to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. Without those linkages to other provinces, there's no way those electricity projects are going to develop and be able to benefit the nation. But there's other opportunities, natural gas pipelines, nuclear. So I think there's quite a cluster in the energy sector that could be a benefit. And then when we think about ports and transportation, if there's ways to strengthen capacity and service around our Class 1 rail lines, major ports, which again can help support what's happening nationally. And again, we've got defense bases and defense-related infrastructure where, again, this region, those investments might help support Canada's defense on the East Coast as well as in the Arctic in terms of how we need to kind of grow our capacity. So I certainly think there's those areas. Energy is certainly one of the biggest buckets, but transportation and defense also should be considered.
The Atlantic premiers really seem to be at the forefront of pulling down interprovincial trade barriers. There's been pieces of legislation, really, I would say my perception is the first out of the gate to enthusiastically embrace more interprovincial trade. Why do you think that is? What is the dynamic in Atlantic Canada that would make them, the first boosters of tearing down barriers?
Well, this is certainly a topic we have researched for many years and tried to encourage without maybe much success. And so, President Trump and his policies have really kind of nudged Canadian provinces like we really need to do something to strengthen our own internal market. So I think there's a couple of factors to keep in mind. Smaller provinces, as we are in Atlantic Canada, do depend more on internal trade. So when you look at imports as a share of our economy, because we have a smaller economic base, we rely more on importing from other provinces or even other countries. So that's certainly a big factor. And some of the research that's been done by Trevor Toom and others, does suggest there are potentially bigger gains from reducing these barriers in Atlantic Canada. One of the early estimates was about 8% of our GDP compared to just over 3% for nationally. So a disproportionate potential impact. So again, I can't speak to Premier Houston and his personal motivation in this, but he has certainly been a bit of a leader in this, moving forward with his legislation to help mutually recognize credentials and products and services have been improved there as long as a province has that reciprocating legislation. So certainly there's been, maybe a number of reasons why the provinces have taken a bit of a lead here.
You alluded to this earlier, but one of the major factors when you're talking about major projects and ambition in terms of Canada and building infrastructure and some of the big things that provinces and the federal government want to do is the workforce, and whether we have the workforce to do what we need to accomplish. What is the human capital story right now in Atlantic Canada? Where are some of the challenges that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, the human capital dimension is critical. And certainly, when you think about big projects, you need lots of tradespeople or engineers for a few years for a big project. Certainly that creates a big deal, especially if you've got multiple projects happening at the same time in a region, as Newfoundland and Labrador has experienced in recent decades, or we've got potentially multiple big projects happening across Canada, all competing for some of those specialized labor. So certainly that can be a challenge. But, I think the labor issues goes well beyond construction and these big projects. We have a talent issue across our region. And just to give some simple statistics, our population is shrinking here in Atlantic Canada. So since 2015, all 4 provinces are seeing more people dying than being born. And at least until 2020, when BC joined us, we were the only provinces actually in that situation. And what that means in terms of the labor market is 30 years ago, for every 10 people retiring, we had 20 young people entering looking for work. Today in Atlantic Canada, for every 10 people retiring, there's actually only 8 young people available to move into those positions. So that gives you a sense of kind of the shift we're seeing over decades, but also we just don't have enough young people entering our labor market to replace those who are retiring. Nationally, it's closer to even. Alberta, Manitoba, there's more people still entering than retiring. So that's the real kind of crux of our labor issue. Unemployment rates have dropped. Halifax, its unemployment rate last year was below Toronto, below Calgary, below Montreal, below Vancouver. So it's not like we have high unemployment, lots of surplus labor. Yes, we have certainly some of that in our seasonal and rural communities, but certainly it's not across the board. So I think the challenge then becomes we've shifted from a situation decades ago where we're trying to find jobs for people. Today, we're trying to find people for the jobs that we have. And so again, investment in capital, automation, AI, especially where you've got some of those hard to fill or repetitive type jobs. Immigration is also then a key strategy. How do we attract and retain workers from elsewhere? And the challenge is this is not just about high skill, high wage jobs. It's also in some of the lower wage service sectors like hospitality, some of the healthcare jobs where we need these workers. So, we have a well-educated population, but we're certainly concerned, are we retaining some of those? Are we losing some of our young males who are not progressing through school or progressing through post-secondary education, maybe not fully employed or underemployed, and are they graduating with their skills and attributes that we need? So I think there's a quantity issue. Do we have enough people? And then there's a quality dimension. Are we training and equipping people with the right skills and the right experiences to be able to really make the contribution that's needed in the labor market today? So I don't think that's necessarily any different than nationally, but the demographic dimension is certainly more acute here in Atlantic Canada.
That certainly struck me when I was in Port aux Basques, just hearing from local economic leaders that as that city rebuilds from Hurricane Fiona, that they had the additional problem of people retiring with small businesses and no one to take them over. And, that it just seems like a pervasive problem in some of the regions that, that there's not enough people that are, as we say in French, prendre la relève, or like taking over the next chapter of an industry. But tell me a bit about housing as well. There's an issue of employment and workforce, but then where do workers live, which I think is also an issue in certain parts of Atlantic Canada.
Yeah, so again, just like the rest of the country, we've seen an increase in house prices. We saw, especially coming out of COVID, a lot of people moving to this region from other parts of Canada, especially if they're moving from Toronto. They're selling $1 million home, able to buy something relatively cheap here in this region, and a good square footage. But they're bringing their Toronto salaries and their Toronto wealth into this market. So we really saw house prices shoot up quite considerably here in this region, especially in Halifax, but Moncton and other communities. So that's really created pressure. So people moving in from other provinces, the huge increase we saw in immigration as we dropped some of those restrictions as COVID eased, it really contributed to some very high population growth, and the housing market just cannot respond that quickly. So I think it's created a lot of pressures in our rental market. Rental rates have really dropped to very low levels. Rental rates for those who are moving into new places have increased. House prices have increased considerably. We have a paper will be coming out on this in the next few months, just trying to document that huge shift. And it's a concern. Anyone who's got young people or children who might be looking to enter that labor market, how are they going to be able to afford to get into the housing market, or even find a place to rent? We see a lot more people either staying with their parents, or there's 3 or 4 people who are not part of the same family sharing accommodation. And even with some other immigrants, I think often they're not just the 2 to 4 person household. There's a lot of them maybe sharing accommodation because they're trying to find a way to make a go of it here. So I think there's a lot of kind of what you might call overcrowding. Like, we've got more people per housing unit than we might traditionally have. So as we expand housing supply, some of those are going to want to move out and get their own things, or it's going to take a bit of time to resolve some of those issues. And I think that the pricing pressures, are not going to suddenly reverse. I don't think we're expecting a big drop in house prices and a collapse. It's about how do we increase supply, especially at some of the lower end or the starter homes for young people looking to move into that market.
Staying just on in the social sphere, obviously there's an inextricable link between economic prosperity and our economic future and our social safety net, and where there might be weaknesses. And the council has done some research on health outcomes in Atlantic Canada. Can you tell us a little bit about your findings and what the link is with economic impact?
Sure. This is a kind of a 2-year project. We're kind of just a quarter of the way through right now, and really looking at a bit of a diagnostic in our first year, like what is the state of the problem, and then as we move into our second year, like what are some of the solutions and lessons that we have for other parts of the country or other jurisdictions or internationally. So I think we've been really trying to help people understand there's an important 3-way relationship here between health, healthcare, and our economy. Healthcare is a big part of our economy, but it also, absorbs a lot of tax resources and workers, and the healthcare sector wants those workers. Other parts of the economy wants those workers. But when you look at some of the costs of poor health, chronic disease, if you look at direct healthcare costs, you look at lost income and productivity, some of those costs that, in Atlantic Canada, we estimate $22 billion a year. Mental health, if we look at direct costs and lost productivity, not counting any lost wages, about $11 billion. So we're talking about 17 or 19% of our GDP. So these are huge costs that we are having to pay. And certainly, thousands of Atlantic Canadians who are not working, participating in the labor force because of either physical health issues or mental health issues. So we're losing productivity, we're losing capacity, and then there's the costs for treatment for individuals with different conditions. So, when we look at this, we really need to think about, how do we create a healthy, sustainable healthcare system that is productive, that's using its resources as well as possible. We're just doing some early research now on our healthcare system and, looking at outcomes relative to inputs. We really need to look at, like, how do we ensure we have the most efficient system? How do we ensure we get the best outcomes, the best improvements in our healthcare system as people come forward with their conditions? And how do we look at prevention and earlier intervention? A lot of those healthcare related issues are about lifestyle, smoking, drinking, drugs, physical activity. Some of these potentially can be changed if we can find a way as a society and individuals to change behaviors. So again, investing in our young people and youth to maybe change some of those trajectories that we're seeing. And as we continue to deal with people who, for whatever reasons, inherited or otherwise, they've got those existing health conditions. But how do we start to change that dynamic? Because it's a huge issue for this economy. We need a sustainable healthcare. It's the biggest part of our provincial budgets. If we continue to see healthcare spending growing faster than our economy, we're just not going to have the resources we need. So there's already existing pressures, but we have to look at some, sustainability from a fiscal point of view, sustainability from a human resources point of view, but it's really critical that we have people who are healthy, who are able to participate, who can then support our economy. Because at the end of the day, if you can't find affordable housing, you can't get a quality education, if you don't have access to quality, affordable healthcare, are you going to want to move to this region? And we need to attract people to this region. Are we going to retain people? So it's really important, and we've been emphasizing this, what I call the social foundations of our economy, or the social foundations of growth. We really need to have those in place, but we certainly need a strong economy to be able to support and finance some of those investments.
That's certainly a message in some of our current research around how communities are in transformation, around energy, but also around tariffs. That we can forget that communities can suffer, and often in the mental health sphere when there's a big, a plant closure or even a plant opening, and people who are suddenly not qualified for the work or need to be retrained, or an exodus of healthcare professionals. Is there how do you account through your research for why Atlantic Canada is particularly vulnerable on health issues, and why the numbers are different?
Yeah, and there's probably a number of factors. Certainly, we have a population that's older than the rest of the country. We've got 4 of the 5 oldest provinces, and we have a more rural population. We've got the most rural provinces, which also then affects the cost of healthcare delivery. Instead of Ontario, where you've got 83% or 4/5 of the population living in the big cities, in Atlantic Canada, it's more than half of our population is living outside those big urban centres. So that can certainly have an impact. Newfoundland has typically had relatively high rates of alcohol consumption. So I think there's some lifestyle issues. Income can also play a role. We know that high income, high education can often contribute to some of that. So I think there's a number of factors that are at play, and it's really about how do we change some of those dynamics? How do we start to really look at that changes can be made, and how do we help create? I think this is really a provincial and a national conversation we need. This is not just about individuals. It's about how do we create communities that are supporting healthy lifestyles and helping then people get access to care when they need it.
David, just to wrap up, I wonder if you could help identify, a few things that you think are missing, in the region that could help build a prosperous, sustainable future, sustainable in the different dimensions that you mentioned. So, from an economic standpoint, and also from a social standpoint, what would you say that just whoever's listening to this, and there are some decision makers listening to this, like what could they do that would really make a difference in the future?
Yeah, well, maybe just re-emphasize some of the topics we've talked about. Certainly interprovincial trade, and we've seen some progress on that, but this is agenda that there's lots of details. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we've, July the 1st has come and gone. I don't think we've fully got that. So I think, how do we maintain momentum to really push forward on that? International trade, how we navigate the US, it's critical, obviously, for the country as a whole, but we depend, as I mentioned earlier, heavily on international trade in Atlantic Canada. So having that, at least some sense of security and stability and what that relationship is going to be going forward, is really critical. And again, just thinking about Atlantic Canada in terms of how can it play a role in defense, critical minerals, energy transition. I certainly think, that's what premiers and the Prime Minister, the federal government, should be thinking about when they look at this region, not just what do we need, but actually how can we contribute? And maybe there's opportunities for strategic investments, but I think, like, how do we look at Canada as a whole and the different resources and diversity of different regions, and how can we bring that together for a whole? I certainly think that's something we need to keep in the current debate. But I think when we think about long-term economic development, I think, for me, the biggest priority is we really need to reprioritize the economy. And I think this is both at the federal level. Prime Minister Carney kind of made the point when he was kind of running to take over the Liberal Party, and Prime Minister, look, we can't take our eye off the economy. We need to keep this as a focus. And I think in the decades that I've been here, we used to see provincial economic development strategies and programs. I don't think you see those quite as clearly these days. We've seen the federal government invest heavily in social programs funded through deficits. I think we really need to think about how do we ensure we have a healthy economy that then supports and finances these investments in the social area. And I think a key part of that is, understanding the important role of the private sector. I know there's lots of business leaders I hear who feel governments are not really listening. They're not really resonating with, look, you want a prosperous economy, but you're not helping through tax policy, you're not helping through regulatory policy, that you can't get projects approved. So I really think we need to focus on how do we create a healthy economy that will then support and be supported by some of these social investments. And I think a key for that is, we need a new vision and a framework for what that prosperity looks like. I think we see provincially and nationally, often we're making reactive decisions. We make a policy change in one area, and we talked about major projects. Well, there's financing for those projects, there's regulatory approval for those projects, there's the labor dimension of those projects, there's Indigenous and the local communities, there's the environment aspects. You can't look at these policies in isolation. We need something that's systematic, a systematic way of looking at these. We need some kind of frame that says, look, this is how Canada needs to grow. That's really vital for this region, that Canada defines a new kind of brand, this is how Canada's going to show up in the region, that helps our firms when they go to market, when they seek investment, that Canada has a strong reputation in the world. So I think, that's part of it. But I really think we need to think about policies on a holistic basis. We've made some reactive changes on immigration, but I'm not sure our labor market policies, when we think about education, immigration, temporary foreign workers, skills and training, EI, they're all interrelated. They all have to be working together to achieve our goal. And unless we're sure what those goals are, how they're going to support these big projects, how they're going to support a healthy, sustainable economy, I don't think we've really got our systematic. These are our policies, these are our priorities, and everything's working to this. And the private sector then has a framework. They've got a business climate where they know they can invest. They know governments are doing what they can to help support on skills. They can then make their own investments. I think that lack of economic focus and that lack of strategic vision is really something that's hindering the Atlantic provinces, and I think even nationally. And if we can all come together and agree on what those priorities are and what the key elements are, people, natural resources, built resources, and the leadership and the policy to do that, I think that's really what's missing in the current agenda. We're just focusing on one or two elements, and I don't think we're thinking systematically, holistically, and from a sustainability point of view, how's this going to play out as we move forward?
Well, I think that our two think tanks are on the same page on that subject in terms of integration and overarching vision or framework for economic policy, industrial policy, having many tentacles. And sometimes when you get at the government level, the tentacles are not attached to any core. They're, as you very elegantly put it, there's got to be a way to look at it as a big picture, and have an integrated vision. David, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciated this conversation.
Oh, you're welcome. Been nice to join you, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in to Future Proofing Canada. Our executive producer is Cléa Desjardins. Our producer is Ricardo Montrose, and our production assistants are Elissa Coury and Blair Elliott. The show is mixed and engineered by Jackie Gallant, who also does our music. If you like what you heard and you'd like to find out more about our work at the IRPP, you can head over to irpp.org. You can subscribe to our newsletters and check out all our latest publications. And if you really, really like what you heard, leave us a review on your podcast app or share your feedback on social media. You can find us on most platforms at IRPP. For the Institute for Research on Public Policy, I'm Jennifer Ditchburn. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode of Future Proofing Canada.